Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, the first successful slave uprising. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, was a landmark event in world history. The first and only successful slave uprising that led to the creation of an independent Black republic. The revolution not only ended French colonial rule in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, but also dealt a significant blow to the institution of slavery and European imperialism. 1. Background. Saint-Domingue, the jewel of the Caribbean. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue, Haiti's colonial name under French rule, was one of the most valuable colonies in the world. It was France's wealthiest colony, producing sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton, which were exported to Europe. The economy depended on the brutal enslavement of Africans, with nearly 500,000 enslaved people working under inhumane conditions on vast plantations. A small but wealthy class of French plantation owners, Grands Blancs, controlled the colony, while a growing population of free people of color, gens de couleur, many of mixed African and European descent, were often denied full rights despite their economic success. Tensions were high between these groups, and the French Revolution, 1789, further inflamed the situation by introducing ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Ideas that enslaved people and free blacks saw as contradictory to their oppression. 2. The Spark. The slave uprising of 1791. In August 1791, a massive slave revolt broke out in the northern plantations of Saint-Domingue. The rebellion was carefully planned by enslaved leaders, including Duty Boukman, a Vodou priest who allegedly led a religious ceremony to inspire the revolt. Tens of thousands of enslaved Africans rose up, burning plantations, killing slave owners, and demanding their freedom. French colonial forces attempted to suppress the rebellion, but the revolutionaries fought back with determination. This marked the beginning of a long and bloody struggle for freedom. 3. The rise of Toussaint Louverture, 1793 to 1802. One of the most important figures to emerge from the revolution was Toussaint Louverture, a former enslaved man who became a brilliant military strategist and leader. By 1793, France was at war with Britain and Spain, both of whom sought to seize Saint-Domingue. Toussaint aligned with the Spanish against the French but later switched sides in 1794, when the French abolished slavery in the colony to gain the support of the black population. Leading the Revolutionary Army, Toussaint defeated both the Spanish and British forces, ensuring French control of the colony under a free black society. By 1801, Louverture had taken full control of Saint-Domingue and declared himself governor for life, instituting a constitution that effectively ended slavery permanently. 4. Napoleon's invasion and the final struggle, 1802 to 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had taken power in France, sought to reassert French control over Saint-Domingue. In 1802, he sent General Charles Leclerc with 40,000 troops, one of the largest expeditionary forces ever, to crush the revolution and reinstate slavery. Louverture's forces waged a brutal guerrilla war, but he was eventually captured by deception and sent to France, where he died in prison in 1803. Despite his loss, the revolution did not end. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, one of Louverture's top generals, took command and defeated the French army at the Battle of Vertières in November 1803. Napoleon's troops, weakened by war and disease, yellow fever, surrendered. 5. Haitian independence, 1804, a new black republic. On January 1, 1804, Jean-Jacques Dessalines declared Haiti an independent nation, making it the first black-led republic in history, the first nation to abolish slavery entirely, the second independent nation in the Americas after the United States. Dessalines renamed the colony Haiti, reclaiming the indigenous Taino name for the land. He declared himself Emperor Jacques I, but his rule was short-lived as internal conflicts soon arose. 6. Global impact and legacy. The Haitian Revolution had far-reaching consequences. Inspired slave rebellions worldwide. Enslaved people across the Caribbean and the US found hope in Haiti's victory, leading to fears among European and American slave owners. France abandoned its colonial ambitions in the Americas. Haiti's resistance contributed to Napoleon's decision to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States in 1803. It challenged racist ideologies. Haiti proved that enslaved people could overthrow oppression, leading to discussions about freedom, race, and equality. Economic and diplomatic isolation. Haiti was ostracized by European and American powers, who feared that Haiti's success would encourage more rebellions. France later forced Haiti to pay a crippling debt for its independence. 7. The Haitian Revolution's enduring legacy. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, remains one of the most significant revolutions in world history. It was the first successful slave uprising, leading to the first Black Republic, and directly challenged the institution of slavery and colonialism. Despite facing economic hardships and political struggles in the centuries that followed, Haiti's victory stands as a powerful testament to the fight for freedom and human dignity. Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, the first women's rights convention in the U.S. Introduction. A historic gathering for equality. The Seneca Falls Convention, held in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, was the first women's rights convention in the United States. This pivotal event marked the beginning of a long and courageous struggle for women's rights, sparking a movement that would grow to challenge deeply entrenched gender norms and demand equality for women in both public and private spheres. The convention was not only about securing the right to vote, but about redefining the roles of women in society, and it laid the groundwork for the women's suffrage movement that would span over 70 years. 1. The road to Seneca Falls. Context and influences. The social climate of the 19th century. The mid-19th century in America was a time of social unrest and reform. While the nation was deeply focused on issues like slavery and westward expansion, the rights of women were largely overlooked. Women were expected to adhere to the domestic sphere, and were denied basic rights such as the ability to vote, own property, or pursue higher education. Women's roles were confined to the home, where they were expected to manage domestic duties, raise children, and support their husbands. Despite their societal restrictions, women began to organize and challenge these limitations, influenced by broader social reform movements like abolitionism and the temperance movement. Early women's rights activism. Before the Seneca Falls Convention, women had been advocating for their rights in smaller circles. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two of the key figures at Seneca Falls, were involved in the abolitionist movement. Their work fighting for the freedom of enslaved people helped them realize the connections between the struggle for racial equality and gender equality. Mott had been denied a seat at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840 simply because she was a woman. This experience inspired her and Stanton to start organizing for women's rights. 2. The Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. Organizing the convention. The Seneca Falls Convention was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. In July 1848, they invited both women and men to a two-day gathering aimed at discussing the social, civil, and religious rights of women. The convention attracted around 300 attendees, a mix of activists, reformers, and those curious about the cause. The Declaration of Sentiments. One of the most significant accomplishments of the Seneca Falls Convention was the Declaration of Sentiments. Modeled after the Declaration of Independence, this document listed grievances against the treatment of women in society. It boldly stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The Declaration of Sentiments included 12 resolutions demanding gender equality, such as the right to vote, the right to higher education, and access to employment and property ownership. The most controversial resolution was the call for women's suffrage, which was debated fiercely but ultimately passed. 3. The key figures and supporters. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the convention's main organizers, was the chief author of the Declaration of Sentiments. She was an influential activist and writer, known for her bravery in speaking out for women's rights in a time when such ideas were controversial. Stanton continued to advocate for women's suffrage throughout her life and worked closely with Susan B. Anthony to push for the 19th Amendment, which would grant women the right to vote in 1920. Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott, a Quaker minister and abolitionist, was instrumental in organizing the convention. Mott's experiences fighting for racial equality made her an ardent supporter of gender equality, and she played a key role in the early years of the women's rights movement. And although Mott did not live to see the ultimate success of the women's suffrage movement, her contributions laid the foundation for future generations of feminists. Frederick Douglass. One of the most prominent figures at the convention was Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved African American and leading abolitionist. Douglass strongly supported the suffrage resolution, arguing that women's rights were intertwined with the fight for freedom and equality for all people, regardless of race or gender. His support was crucial in gaining wider acceptance for the idea of women's suffrage in a movement that was largely dominated by white, middle-class women. 4. The aftermath. Challenges and progress. Initial reactions and controversy. The convention and its declaration of sentiments were met with mixed reactions. Many people in the United States were shocked by the idea that women should have the same rights as men, especially the right to vote. Newspapers ridiculed the event, and some local newspapers labeled the convention as radical or even insurrectionist. Nonetheless, the convention brought the issue of women's rights into the public consciousness and laid the groundwork for future activism. The growth of the women's rights movement. And although the Seneca Falls Convention did not lead to immediate legal changes, it was the beginning of a growing movement. The women's suffrage movement would gain momentum over the next several decades, culminating in the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. Key figures such as Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and Ida B. Wells would continue to champion women's rights, taking inspiration from the Seneca Falls Convention. 5. The legacy of Seneca Falls. A pioneering event in women's history. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 was not just a singular event, but the spark that ignited the women's rights movement in the United States. The ideas put forth at the convention would resonate across generations, as women would continue to fight for their rights and equality for over 70 years. The Declaration of Sentiments was a revolutionary document that echoed the values of the American Revolution but applied them to gender relations. Inspiration for future movements. The Seneca Falls Convention inspired countless other women's rights conventions, organizations, and campaigns, both in the US and around the world. It contributed to the broader global women's rights movement, influencing not just political and social structures but also deeply ingrained attitudes toward gender equality. The first step toward equality. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 was a bold declaration that women deserved the same rights and freedoms as men. By bringing together passionate advocates for change and crafting a document that boldly proclaimed equality, it laid the foundation for the women's rights movement in the U.S. The vision put forth at Seneca Falls would take years to fully realize, but the convention represented a pivotal moment in the ongoing fight for women's equality and continues to inspire movements for gender justice and human rights today. Communist Manifesto Published, 1848, a revolutionary call for social change. Introduction. A call to revolution. In 1848, the world witnessed the publication of one of the most influential political pamphlets in history, the Communist Manifesto. Written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, this manifesto set forth a radical vision for a new society based on the principles of equality, class struggle, and revolutionary change. The manifesto called for the working class, or proletariat, to rise up against the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, in a fight to overthrow capitalist systems and establish a society without social classes. The ideas presented in the Communist Manifesto would go on to shape not only social and labor movements but also the course of world history, influencing revolutions, political ideologies, and the establishment of communist states. 1. The context: political and economic turmoil. The Industrial Revolution and rising inequality. The mid-19th century was a time of profound economic and social change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society, leading to urbanization, the rise of factories, and massive changes in labor. As industry grew, so did social inequalities. A growing working class faced harsh conditions, including long hours, low wages, and unsafe working environments. Meanwhile, the capitalist class, wealthy factory owners, bankers, and industrialists, amassed great fortunes, creating a widening divide between the rich and the poor. This growing inequality laid the foundation for the critiques presented in the Communist Manifesto, political movements and revolutions. In 1848, revolutions and uprisings were erupting across Europe, fueled by dissatisfaction with the existing political systems. The revolutionary spirit was in the air, and people were calling for democratic reforms, social justice, and economic change. Marx and Engels saw these uprisings as a sign that the working class was beginning to awaken to its potential power. They believed that the time was ripe for a global proletarian revolution that would overthrow capitalism and establish a new socialist order. 2. The birth of the Communist Manifesto. The role of Marx and Engels. Karl Marx, a German philosopher and economist, had been studying the social and economic conditions of the time and had developed a radical critique of capitalism. His previous works laid the intellectual foundation for the manifesto. Friedrich Engels, a German social scientist and businessman, shared Marx's views and collaborated with him to write the Communist Manifesto. Engels brought his practical experience and insights into the working conditions of the industrial proletariat, having witnessed firsthand the exploitation of workers in factories. Together, Marx and Engels were determined to create a text that would serve as a rallying cry for the oppressed masses to unite against their exploiters. The publication. The Communist Manifesto was first published on February 21, 1848, by the Communist League, a small group of revolutionary socialists based in Europe. The manifesto was short, at just a few dozen pages, but it packed a powerful punch. It outlined the fundamental principles of Marxism and the need for a proletarian revolution to overthrow capitalist societies. 3. The core ideas of the Communist Manifesto. Class struggle and historical materialism. The Communist Manifesto begins with a stark and simple declaration. The history of all hitherto societies is the history of class struggles. Marx and Engels argued that societies have always been divided into social classes, the oppressors and the oppressed. Throughout history, these class struggles have driven societal change. In feudal society, the primary division was between nobles and serfs. In the modern era, it was between the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, the working class. Historical materialism is the idea that material conditions, such as the means of production, technology, and economic systems, shape society, and as these conditions change, so too does the class structure. The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, or capitalist class, controls the means of production, factories, land, and capital. They profit from the labor of the proletariat, or working class, who sell their labor in exchange for wages. Marx and Engels argued that the bourgeoisie exploits the proletariat, and the wealth generated by the workers is concentrated in the hands of the few. This, they argued, leads to profound alienation for the workers, who become mere cogs in the machine of industrial production. The call for revolution. Marx and Engels argued that the proletariat would eventually become aware of its exploitation and unite to overthrow the bourgeoisie. The manifesto boldly calls for the abolition of private property and the creation of a classless society where the means of production are controlled collectively. In this new society, the wealth produced by labor would be distributed more equally. They believed that capitalism would inevitably collapse, driven by its inherent contradictions and the exploitation of the working class. Once the proletariat overthrew the bourgeoisie, a socialist society would emerge, eventually leading to a stateless, communist society. 4. The impact of the Communist Manifesto. Influence on social and labor movements. The Communist Manifesto had an immediate impact, inspiring workers' movements, socialist organizations, and revolutionary groups across Europe. The 1848 revolutions, which swept across the continent, were partly inspired by the ideas put forth in the manifesto. The manifesto also influenced the formation of labor unions and the rise of socialist political parties in Europe and beyond. These movements pushed for better working conditions, higher wages, and universal suffrage. The spread of Marxist ideas. The ideas of the Communist Manifesto spread beyond Europe, becoming a blueprint for revolutionaries in other parts of the world. Marxism would influence major political revolutions, most notably the Russian Revolution of 1917, where Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks implemented Marxist principles to establish the first communist state. Communist ideologies also had a profound impact on the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, and various other socialist movements in the 20th century. 5. Legacy and criticism of the Communist Manifesto. Long-lasting impact. The Communist Manifesto has continued to influence political thought and action for over 170 years. While it did not immediately bring about the revolutionary changes Marx and Engels envisioned, its vision of a classless, stateless society remains a significant ideological force. Marxism became a foundational theory for many socialist and communist movements worldwide. In countries like China, Cuba, and the Soviet Union, Marxist ideas would shape government policies and societal structures, often leading to deep social and political transformations. Criticism and debate. Despite its profound influence, the Communist Manifesto and the broader Marxist ideology have been the subject of intense debate and criticism. Critics argue that Marxism, when applied in practice, led to authoritarian regimes and economic failures in countries like the Soviet Union and Maoist China. Additionally, some claim that Marx's predictions about the inevitable collapse of capitalism and the rise of a proletarian revolution did not come to pass in the way he envisioned. Nevertheless, the Communist Manifesto continues to inspire critiques of capitalism and remains a key text in leftist political thought. A revolutionary manifesto for the ages. The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, was more than just a political pamphlet. It was a call to action that resonated across borders and generations. Its revolutionary vision for a classless society and its fierce critique of capitalist exploitation sparked social and labor movements that still echo in political struggles today. Marx and Engels may have called for a revolution that never fully materialized as they had hoped, but the manifesto's ideas shaped the course of history, from the Russian Revolution to the rise of socialism in the 20th century. Even now, the Communist Manifesto remains a significant and contentious text, its influence undeniable as it continues to provoke thought, debate, and action around issues of economic inequality and social justice.